I'm Larry Weeks, and this is Bounce.
Personal resilience is an amalgam of abilities and processes, strengths, core beliefs, which together enable us to adapt, recover, maybe, grow as well, sometimes from failure and adversity and all kinds of traumatic experiences. I don't think you can prepare, but I do agree and acknowledge that I think I was better prepared. Does that make, is there a distinction there? Because I had studied resilience psychology. Students and all of us need to be prepared for the tests of life, not just a life full of tests. Grief is as individual as your fingerprint. Parental bereavement is considered to be the hardest type of loss to adapt to.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bounce. Today on the podcast, my guest is Dr. Lucy Hone. Lucy is a pracademic, a practicing academic in the field of resilience and wellbeing psychology at AUT University's Human Potential Center in Auckland, New Zealand. She has a PhD in public health and wellbeing sciences, and she is the author of the book Resilient Grieving, Finding Strength and Embracing Life After a Loss That Changes Everything. And on this podcast, we will discuss the impact of that study during the darkest period of her life. On the 31st of May in 2014, her 12-year-old daughter, Abby, was killed in a tragic car accident. In the days and months following the loss of her daughter and her best friend, Lucy turned to writing to help her order her thoughts and explore her feelings of loss. Combining academic research and her personal insights, she first wrote a blog, which attracted a large international audience and led to her book, Resilient Grieving. It quickly became a bestseller and is now available in the U.S. While she says learning to live without Abby is still very much a work in progress, she acknowledges that the work she does to support others, to inform them that they do have choices in how they grieve, has gone some way to make sense out of the senseless. This is definitely a heavy topic. Lucy, in our discussion today, tells her story, talks about her story. She discusses the research that's out there on grief and sudden loss, what resilience research teaches us about a healthy grieving process, what has been shown to help people cope during bereavement. And we have an interesting discussion on the latest on stage theories of grief, which I think you'll find very interesting. And I think we've all heard the stages such as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But is that how one really ought to grieve? We talk about that. Like I said, it's a heavy topic, but I think everyone should hear this conversation. In 2008, my sister was killed in a car accident in Pensacola, Florida. Within a couple of months of that, my mother passed away as well, partly, in my opinion, due to the grief that she felt over losing her daughter. She was sick. My mother was sick, yes, but I think grief sapped whatever life force she had left to fight. I wish Lucy's book had been written then, or some book about the grieving process. And maybe there was, but obviously I wasn't aware of it. I wish that resource was available, and if there was, I wish I had the foresight to read it. No one prepares for such events because no one wants to think about that type of an event, or very few people want to think about death. And when it happens, we have no mental ropes to hang on to a lot of the time, and no knowledge of what's to come as far as grief and the grieving process. Lucy's book, just even though I'm at peace with what happened now, and I mean, you never get over it, but there's so many things that Lucy mentions in the book that we talk about that are fairly common to people going through the grieving process that I think had I been aware of it, there would have been some comfort in that. Even though everyone has their own journey as far as grief, but just to know that some of the things I felt and kind of went through, other people, many, 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 many other people go through. So listen to the podcast, read the book, learn how best to help others when they're grieving. So let's talk to Lucy. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Larry from New Zealand. It is morning here.
Did I get everything right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your kind introduction. And it's a privilege for me to be here with you and your listeners.
I was telling you earlier that I suffered a loss suddenly of my sister some years ago, and I told you that I wish your book had been around then, and nobody's prepared for these type of things. I was just thinking as I was reading your book that I'm glad the book's out there, but I wish there were like more formal classes. I wish people were like required to kind of take classes in maybe preparing for death and dying. Does that make sense? Because only after the fact, when it's too late, do you kind of scramble for resources like this. I think, because life is nothing. Impermanence is a fact of life, but it's easy to forget, if that makes sense. So I was just struck by, as I was reading, I'm like, people should read this before they need to read it. People should prepare themselves before things like this happen. I would hope families talk about death, and some of the concepts that you have in the book, but because it certainly I would have had more of a resource, and you can never prepare. I'm not saying, I don't think, and maybe you can comment, but I'm not sure how much you can prepare for something like this.
I don't think you can prepare, but I do agree and acknowledge that I think I was better prepared. Does that make, is there a distinction there?
Yes.
Because I had studied resilience psychology, and because I live in Christchurch, and we had gone through a series of large magnitude quakes from 2011 to, well, really still quite recently, that I had also had to apply that resilience research to the real world context already. And so I think that process of thinking about, well, how useful are these strategies in everyday life, and how useful are these in the post-quake environment? Some of that, I think, had prepared me, just very basic things, Larry, like I knew from my work that reestablishing the family routine was really important for us when we were trying to recover and get through those first few days particularly. And I knew that that's disaster recovery 101. And not everybody knows that. So I guess that's why I wrote the book, because so many people have written to me. I mean, really, so many people. I get, Facebook messages and emails all the time of people saying to me, thank you just for, apart from anything else, people write to me to say, thank you for validating the fact that I wanted to do something, and I wanted to be an active participant in my grief. And funnily enough, I don't know if you know this, but I do a lot of work in schools nowadays. And part of that work is preparing young people for whatever life throws at them. We do a lot of bringing resilience into schools now, and that's a field called positive education, and I'm heavily involved in that here in New Zealand, because like you, I feel passionate that we need students, and all of us need to be prepared for the tests of life, not just a life full of tests.
Yeah. I should connect those dots, because you make a good point. Resilience, this whole field that's opened up now in positive psychology it includes resilience, which is a big part of it, which is really what your book is about. And it does that those are the tools, right? Some of that within
those
them. Yeah.
They came from positive psychology. I'd studied for my master's at the University of Pennsylvania where I'd studied with Marty Seligman and Karen Rivich, Chris Peterson, all the kind of thought leaders of the field. Angela Duckworth, the Grit book, which I think became a big thing in America last year. So I had the tools, but what I was kind of stunned to discover once the girls had died was that I couldn't find any literature where the tools of positive psychology had been applied to the bereavement context. They've been applied to all sorts of other traumas, it seemed, but the fields of bereavement and positive psychology hadn't yet made that connection. So that, I guess, I'm an academic and I want to contribute to the field. I want to grow the field and have independent thought. And that's what my contribution was just doing the nexus between those two fields.
So real quickly, tell us your story as to what happened. And you were in the middle of this type of training and studying. You were working on your master's, PhD. Where were you?
Yes. I was actually a pretty long way through my PhD studies by then. So I think I had published 3 or 4 papers. And the way I did it over here, you had to publish 5 papers. And then you could go and do the exams. So I was nearing the end of my PhD. Our children were 12, 14 and 15 at the time. It was a public holiday weekend at the very beginning of June. I mean, we're about to go through our 3rd anniversary this weekend coming. So Sally, the other mother, and I, we were planners. We were the holiday planners in our families, and we wanted to go down to a beautiful part of New Zealand, right down south, called Lake Ohau, and we were going mountain biking for the weekend. So we had actually 3 families going down there for the weekend. And at the last minute, Abby wanted to hop in the car with Ella and go with her and drive down to Ohau. I should add that Abby and Ella were pretty much inseparable, Abby, Ella, and their other friend, Imogen. So it wasn't a rare occurrence for her to hop in that car. And so she did that, and we were all having dinner. The 2 of our families were having dinner down at Ohau that evening, and the Summerfield family were delayed, but we knew they were doing a couple of jobs in town after the sport had finished, so we weren't unduly concerned at all. And then we started getting a few texts amongst our 2 families. And suddenly we got a phone call. The people who ran the lodge came over to say, there's a policeman on the phone for you. And, that is the phone call that every parent dreads, isn't it? And it's so surreal that there is no way anything prepares you for that moment. And I guess I don't often particularly dwell on it now. I mean, I think any parent who has lost a child will tell you that there is a place that is hell. And as beautiful as Ohau is, there are parts of that building that are hell for us as a family. And so a driver had just driven through a stop sign on a rural backcountry road and ploughed straight into their car. The only good thing was they were killed instantly. We know that. So the 2 little girls, Abby and Ella, in the back, and Sally. And Sally was a really dear friend of mine too, Larry. So that's been a whole nother grief as well. And she would have been the person that, I would have gone through my with, and she's not here. So
how did you talk to your children about this?
We told our children that night, and honestly, I don't even really want to think about it, go back there at all. But generally, some of the interesting things about my children, and my boys now are 19 and 17, so I try not to talk about them too much in interviews. They've got lives to lead, and they don't need mother going on all sorts of public places about them. But we all chose to forgive the driver. And we did that on that journey home. I don't know who, but someone said, we're not going to blame the driver, are we? And I remember thinking, wow, no, we're not going to blame the driver. Thank goodness we're clearly all unified on that. And that was a first really important step forward for all of us, I think, just being unified not in blame and not in anger, but in this willingness to move forward, to literally go forward rather than look backwards.
I was wondering as I read your book, is there any research out there on the impact of sudden loss being particularly more difficult than prolonged loss, or is it just?
There is research saying that sudden death, those people do suffer terribly. They often get isolated and, they feel bewildered and traumatized and can very often need specialist support to help them cope and move forwards in their lives. And then added to that, there is definitely research that shows that parental bereavement is considered to be the hardest type of loss to adapt to. But having said that, all of loss is hard, isn't it?
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
And
I wasn't saying that. I'm just wondering if they're hard in their own particular way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there is definitely evidence to show that a sudden bereavement is more likely to result in traumatic grief reactions than an expected bereavement, because you get some time, don't you? However terrible it is, you're already grieving for an expected bereavement. That process has already occurred. Whereas with sudden loss, you're just thrown into it.
That's a great way of putting it. I remember when I heard, I was having lunch with a friend and my father called me, and I just went into, I became like a zombie. I didn't know what to do. And I was 8 hours. I was 8 hours away. We were both in the state of Florida, but Florida's a very big state. But it wasn't like they were around the corner. I had to plan. I had to get a flight and had to do all this planning. But I just remember going into just this weird fog, just for a couple of hours. I had a friend that actually I was trying to book a flight, and he really had to help me book the flight because I just was just kind of confused. Anyway.
It's funny because that's number one example that you've given me of how relationships help us through bereavement. Your friend was there. He helped you book a flight. And I remember feeling like I was on sort of semi-autopilot for the first 3-4 weeks. I don't know how long, but, particularly the first 10 days where it felt like people just held me from behind by the shoulders and pointed me where I needed to go. I honestly was, your word, a zombie, is absolutely how I felt, because you are just incredulous. I mean, your entire life scheme has been smashed to smithereens. And, we call that in psychology your life schema, your life story, your identity, what you normally do during the day, all of those things. It's like, I don't know if I wrote this in the book, but I remember thinking it's like someone had taken a mallet, like a croquet mallet, to my life and smashed the entirety. So it just no longer exists. I did write about Thomas Attig's work. He talks about relearning to live in the world. And I think that's really beautiful, because that is what we have to do.
Yeah, his name was Jeff Davis. I just want to say his name because he will forever be, I will be indebted to what he did. He didn't. So he was with me at lunch, and then he saw me leave. I said, "Hey, I got to go," and he knew what happened. And I was home. I went home by myself, and I'm trying to, as you can imagine, my mom is just. I'm trying to calm her down, and then I'm trying to get this flight, and all of a sudden, I get a knock on the door, and he's there, and he sees me struggling, and God bless him just to help me get through that. So,
beautiful poem in the book about the people in the significant moments of our lives.
Yeah.
So Jeff Davis is one of yours.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Resilient Grieving, and it suggests its opposite. Is there? I'm assuming there's fragile grieving, and forgive me for the lack of the proper word, but is there a grieving process that could weaken us?
Yes, there are things that we can or can't do that are known to increase the risks of complicated grief, is what the bereavement field would call it. And those are really pretty much the opposite of the things that we do to promote the likelihood of remaining resilient in our grief. And things like just cutting yourself off from all friends and support groups, persistent denial, chronic denial, relying on self-medication, but my book, and you've read it, Larry, I hope you'll agree, it's not about punishing people and setting them an agenda to be tough. I mean, actually, the last thing as I say, you've read it, so you know this. The last thing I would want people to do was try and tough it out, because resilient grieving involves walking into every aspect of grief, accepting that it is a miserable and terrible phase of your life. It probably gets better. 3 years in, I can say it is very different to how it was in that first year and even second year, actually. But really, the title comes from the fact that I was desperate, faced with such helplessness, and I couldn't control anything about the girl's death. I was just desperate to exert all the control I possibly could on our response to their death. And so luckily for me, I had these tools and strategies from resilience. I just should add that my definition is that personal resilience is an amalgam of abilities and processes, strengths, core beliefs, which together enable us to adapt, recover, maybe, grow as well, sometimes from failure and adversity and all kinds of traumatic experiences. So, and it's not something you have or you don't have. I think it's really important that people understand it's a capacity for coping. And so that's what I wanted to do, was give people all the tools that I knew might be helpful for them in their bereavement, in their grief process, and give them the opportunity to work out which of them helped. I'm very into that. It's not me saying it's me saying this is what worked for me. Try some of these. I mean, that's what we know from psychology, is that you really have to be your own experiment. You have to try things out. We're all different, aren't we, Larry? You and I know that.
Yeah, you and I like, there's some, I'm not going to do it justice, but in the book you talk about kind of finding your own way. Look, there's, people deal with it in different ways. Just however you're getting through and what's helping you through, just do that, right?
What you and I, the book's about, is that I felt we were only given by the kind of grief experts, we were told that grief is as individual as your fingerprint, that that we knew about the 5 stages of loss from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I think most people can name 2 or 3 of those, and that's probably where I was at that phase. But I remember thinking, I just was overwhelmed by how passive those resources were. And I understand that in their desire not to put any additional pressure on the bereaved, the grief authorities, it seemed to me, had just said, oh, poor you, this is what you're going to feel. So they talked about your grief reaction, literally how you will react. So it was all about the fact that you will have all these emotions, but it wasn't ever, I didn't really find ever anywhere some information about what I could do. And faced with the absolutely helpless situation, I think I wasn't alone. So many people are desperate to know that they are that they can do what they can to get through. What you said is whatever is helping you, just keep doing that. And one of the main fundamental tools I talk about in the book is this helping or harming me? And that's comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a really basic strategy to help people with their decision making. So you find yourself thinking, the fifth glass of wine, is that helping or harming me? Going for a run today, is that helping or harming me? Going to the courtroom to watch the driver have his trial, was that helping us or harming us? Well, I knew it was going to harm us. So, really this is what my book's about. It's about kind of returning agency to the bereaved.
I wanted to go back to what you mentioned earlier about the stages of grief, because that's all I ever heard. I think everybody kind of grows up hearing about, and actually, I think it's in the cultural jet stream, the 5 stages of grief, right? The whatever they are: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And that's the only thing I knew. And occasionally when I would feel a certain way, whether it be anger or depression, I would think, I'm going through these particular stages. And
that's kind of helpful, isn't it? I did find it, that's reasonably helpful.
It's reasonably helpful, but it's interesting that it seems the stage theories have little evidentiary support. I want your input on this. It was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross way back in the day in the 60s, I believe, but really no study has ever been established that stages of grief actually exist.
And do you know that she didn't even write it for the bereaved? That was actually for people who were in end of life. So those 5 stages were for the people themselves who were coming to terms with their death, not actually for the people who get left behind, which is who got left with them.
Right. But I mean, people, I remember people will reflexively, they'll use it and they'll actually, I've heard it people telling me when I was kind of going through grief, you have to go through that. You have to do this. You have to, because they're again, reflexively just spitting out this theory of the stages when, the more I researched into those, look, that doesn't.
No, absolutely. And I'm a classic case of, so I started with acceptance. I mean, and don't ask me how, but in week 1, Trevor, my husband, and I decided that we were going to accept the loss. And that for us was absolutely the first job we had to do. And we managed to do it pretty easily and intuitively. And I don't know why. I mean, that's just something about the people we are and the way we're made up and the way we process things. And I remember we discussed the fact that she could have died from, cancer. And that would have been different and more terrible in some ways, because we would have had to watch her go through misery. At least there was, from our point of view, we got left with the additional grief from a sudden death where she didn't. So we started with acceptance. We've never felt anger. I refuse to do bargaining. I just, the what ifs I do, I'll go for 2 or 3 of them. And by the 3rd, I think, stop it.
Yeah, I couldn't do that. Yeah.
The point in this, I mean, again, that's my training. Rumination, we know it doesn't serve us any good. After sort of 30 seconds or a minute, then you're just going down a rabbit warren. So
I'm not saying that you're not someone doesn't feel depression or want to bargain or anger and all that. I'm just saying it seems like it may be more harm than good if somebody's telling you, if you haven't gone through this stage, you haven't finished the grieving process.
And so I have thought that, because I haven't felt anger. I have before I did my research, I did used to think, am I in denial then? And is anger waiting to come and bite me? Am I deluded because I've gone straight to acceptance? I mean, so yeah, it's not a helpful model, I don't think.
So, that's one thing we could, for the audience, whoever, that, look, don't throw this model on top of everything else that's happening to you. You're dealing with it however you're dealing with it. My brothers, they had a lot of anger. I had none. I was just defeated or deflated or whatever term you want to use. I didn't have enough. I didn't have emotion left over I didn't have that energy. So is there a model though?
So there are models out there. There's the Worden 4 stages of grief works. There are models out there. They pretty much say that you have to, acceptance is important, and eventually to say that somebody has had a healthy adaptation to their loss, acceptance needs to be part of that. So I think, but that doesn't tell you how to get acceptance. And it takes time, for lots of people, it just takes time. I think it's not necessarily that helpful to get strung up on models, which actually is why in the end you might have seen I put a jigsaw puzzle in the back of my book, because I feel that's more appropriate, given that someone has smashed the elements of my life, to disarray. These were the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and it really felt like that in my head. I'd read about something and I'd think, like the grief ambush that I talk about in my book, where you just can be in the supermarket and suddenly you're sobbing. Well, I read about that and thought, okay, yeah, that's good. The grief ambush, that's one of my pieces of the jigsaw. Just knowing about that and knowing that I'm not completely mad, but this happens to other people too, helped me.
Yeah, somehow when I saw, there was this recognition, and so much of your book was just recognizing what I had went through, and I'm sure everybody who reads the book that has gone through something like this does the same thing. But the ambush grief, I was like, there was something comforting. It was like, oh, that's a thing. I can name what, because it still happens. It still happens. But I remember early in the process, Lucy, early after the loss of my sister and my mom, I was in, I wouldn't say, would I forget that they were gone? I don't know, but I was in a store, and I don't know if it was a vitamin store or I can't remember what kind of store it was, but there was something that I saw that immediately I thought my mom or my sister would like it. And it was like I had forgotten for a second that they were gone, because I intended to buy that. And immediately in the store, ambush grief. I wish I had known about it, because I could have named it, but I thought there was something wrong with me. But all of a sudden it hit me like a ton of bricks. I just broke down in the store. I was embarrassed. I was like, what? Oh my gosh, I got to get this together. I didn't see it coming. And then I was in a year or so later from that incident, I was in a movie. Of course, I should have known this. It was about Clint Eastwood directed a movie about the afterlife. I can't remember the name of it. And I don't know. I was interested in the topic. I didn't even think about, my sister and mom. But I'm in the movie, and there's a psychic in the movie who can really talk to someone who's passed on. It's Matt Damon or whatever. But anyway, so some scene like that is coming up, and all of a sudden it hit me in the theater. It just like a ton of bricks, and I just lost it in the theater. So to seeing that, oh, there's a thing, and this is common.
I'm not alone.
Yes. Yeah. And so to that point, because I didn't know, in your book you were talking about support groups, and
yes,
talking to you is empowering, because you've gone through something and you can identify with me, and there's something. It feels like there's not only commonality, but there's something that people who haven't gone through it, I don't know, it's intimate to some degree. So is that also, because I never went to a support group in that way, is that writ large? Is that helpful? Are support groups helpful?
I think so. What is writ large, what is absolutely known to be helpful in resilience, are strong, supportive social connections. And I think the most important message is we need them. So you go and find them however you can find them. So if you happen to live in a community that will look after you, and you've got perhaps really, strong family who are willing to go the distance with you, then you might find that you don't need a support group. But if you're living in a rural, isolated environment, then an online support group or any other online book group, or what doesn't need to be a grief group, but any group that will give you friendship and reaction and interaction with other people is useful. I think actually grief support groups can be useful for some people. And actually, I went online to one at one point, and I didn't find it helpful because I felt that people were, and I'm not blaming, so this is going to sound like I'm judging them. This is just a fact. They were still very much in their, there was a sense of helplessness, and they were experiencing the grief reaction. You know, they were going through the full range of emotional grieving. And for me, as I say, I'm kind of inherently solution focused. So I immediately jumped to the what can I do? And I knew the rules that were you weren't allowed to, you know, offer people advice and say, oh, you should do this. Or I certainly wasn't going to do that. But I think I did just find it didn't work for me because the tone was just empathy and not enough action. So, you know, again, that's going back to being your own experiment, discovering what works for you, being willing to try things is really important.
You talk about in the book secondary losses. Can you elaborate for us here?
Yes. So this might be my turn to cry. So the secondary losses are your primary loss is the person who died. Your secondary losses are all the things that you lose with that person. So they can be really practical. You could, if you've lost your husband or your wife, your partner, you might have lost, for instance, anything from the person who loaded the dishwasher to the person who booked your holidays, who had a handle on finances, who mowed the lawn, you know, all those really kind of practical things. So you suffer the loss, additionally, a secondary loss of not having that person. But for me, Abby never did anything around the house, obviously, as a 12-year-old girl. So I didn't lose practical stuff. I lost the emotional stuff. So we were a family of 5 with a daughter, and now we're not. And you ask anybody who has a daughter in a family, it's a different family. You know, the boys, gorgeous, lovely, beautiful boys, are so different to girls. And I really keenly feel that loss. You know, come Christmas time, nobody wants to talk to me about what we should have to eat on Christmas Day. Nobody wants to decorate the tree in the same way. And so I really do miss, I know that I'm not ever going to have, you know, my daughter walk down the aisle. My husband's never going to get to do that. And it's all that living without the little girl grows up. You know, it is, for me and our family, it is a massive secondary loss. We are a completely different family to the one we would have been. And I have to accept that.
You said you also lost some aspect of your personality?
I think I don't feel that. No, well, so I don't feel it as much now. But when at the beginning, yeah, I mean, I think you just have a crisis of identity. Well, yeah, and it is quite common. You lose the sort of meaning and as I say, your kind of life story. So I was a mother of 3, finishing my PhD, and I remember saying to one of Abby's gorgeous school teachers, a lady called Bridget, you know, I don't even know who I am any longer. And she said to me, but you'll always be a mother of 3. And I thank her for it, because she was the first person that introduced that idea to me, that you can continue, of course, to love the person who has gone. And I will always be a mother of 3. She's just not physically here. But, you know, I can still forge that relationship, a continuing relationship with her. So I don't feel so much, I was about to say, I don't feel so much that I have changed my identity and personality now, but there have been changes, Larry. I mean, you know, I am a sadder person. I feel less frivolous, less flippant. You know, there is depth that comes that they make their mark on you. I remember reading many years ago some novelist had written, and that is fitting for me.
Yeah, I identified with the secondary losses, and my mother and sister were, I didn't realize this, but they were the glue that brought all of the families and nieces and nephews and because we didn't all live in the same city, brought us together for holiday periods or just get together, family get together. And I didn't realize that, but now we get together less. It's a little more fractured. It just happened. It just kind of fell apart that way, if that makes sense.
And it's my job now to try to stop that from happening, but with in a very delicate way. That's my biggest job now, is keeping the family together. But when you've got the age boys we have, it's not easy. 19, 17, and girls definitely. Obviously not for every family, but you talk to a lot of people, and the girls are the ones who phone home, as you say. They arrange the social events around the holiday periods, and so it's a big loss, that, and it is that's an ongoing loss. That still gets me ambushed by grief.
Tell us the difference between you write of a grief reaction versus a grief response.
So I came across this from Tom Attig, who is a bereavement researcher, and so it was him that his book is called Relearning to Live in the World, and I just really resonated with his work, and it was him that made this distinction for me. He says that a grief reaction is all about our immediate experience to the loss. So it's that full range of emotional, psychological, physical, social, it's how we immediately react to the loss. It's kind of passive. Those are the 5 stages of grief, sort of thing. We can go into all of those emotions. The grief response is a more thoughtful process. It's about how we respond to that reaction, the choices that we make over our emotional and psychological, physical behavior. And so my book's very much about the grief response. In it, I do talk about emotions and say, that actually what we know from resilience research is that a resilient person experiences all emotions. There is nothing wrong with feeling fear or guilt or anger. So your grief response is about how we respond, and very much taking control where we can and accepting the things that we can't control.
Yeah, you talk about rumination, and I certainly early on after the event, you ask the questions why, or you just go over in your head what happened over and over again. How does one deal with that?
Yeah, rumination is a big problem for a lot of people, and I think so. You've got to be kind to yourself, haven't you? You've got to let yourself ruminate for a bit, because partly what you're doing is you're processing the loss, so you're trying to make sense of it. So there are ways around that, because what we know is that too much rumination doesn't do us any good. So we need to find ways to climb out of rumination. And I have a dear friend here who lost her daughter just 6 months before me. I didn't know her, but I've met her in bereavement. And she talks about tidying the teaspoon drawer. And she says, she can be wallowing, lying on the couch and absolutely just completely enveloped in her grief and ruminating, going over and over about how that happened. And then she thinks, okay, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do some really menial, tiny chore that will just help me get off the couch. So she said, even if that is tidying the teaspoon drawer, it means that I've actually moved, and that movement helps break the rumination and the focusing your attention to. So we talk a lot about getting people to know how they can distract themselves. That we know is one of the most effective ways out of rumination, is to do something that really engages your brain. So whether that's phoning a friend or doing a jigsaw puzzle or cooking a recipe that you don't know, so you really have to focus on that, whatever it is that will enable you to be forced to focus your attention elsewhere. And I think that's really useful for people to know that too much rumination doesn't serve them well. So going back to the helping or harming me, sitting looking at photos for hours on end. The first 15 minutes, I let myself do that. But once we get past 15 minutes, I think, no, now you're ruminating. So,
Do you think people think they have to? Is there some, again, going back to this guilt, or is there some compunction that people think? Do you think people have that? Oh, I need to remember and look at the pictures.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, pictures, I let myself do that. I don't, interestingly, I don't do it as often nowadays. I still do it occasionally. But I think it is part of the processing. So I think it is an important process because it's part of acceptance, isn't it? Accepting the reality of what actually has happened. And it's okay to look at old photos and feel sad and cry, but you need to look after yourself too. So there's another great theory that I discovered in the bereavement literature that's called oscillation theory. And that says that you need to approach your grief full on, in any way you want, in a minor way or a major way, but then you also need to withdraw. And knowing that's been really helpful for me, Larry, and I know other people have found that helpful, that you can't keep slamming yourself at that wall, and that it's totally fine to take a break, to immerse yourself in some engaging activity, to do something else and take a break from it, because you'll go back there again. And I like this sort of feeling of the ebb and flow, that you approach it and then you withdraw, and then you approach it and then you withdraw, and that's normal.
Yeah, I like that. That's really good. I distraction is not denial. Sometimes you need to take a break for yourself. I keep thinking, of what my sister would be saying to me and others, and I really believe she'd be like, look, get on with it. She loved, oldies but goodies type of music. She'd say, play the, I could hear her say, play the radio, go dance, go live. I just know
Your
her,
life.
right? Go on, but that's a great point.
And we have to do us, don't we? You obviously know her well enough. I know Abby well enough to know what she would have wanted me to do. And actually, for me, I feel that particularly strongly about Sally. She's just a couple of years older than me. She has no life to live now, and it is my job to live for her.
That's powerful. I thought, when I was reading about distraction, I thought absolutely, people need to know that it's okay to pull away. In fact, it's important to pull away. You just go crazy. Lucy, this is so good. I was trying to think back on when people were reaching out to me and offering to help. How can friends and family help? So the people are listening. We've got people who are going through this, and there's people who know people going through it. For those folks, what is helpful?
People do just ask you, don't they? And you have to feel sorry for people who are so desperately wanting to help and don't know how to. So one of the points I make in my book is to say to the bereaved, please, you need your friends. Tell them what you need. Don't get involved in blaming your friends for not doing the right things for you. Instead, you have to be a bit bold here and say, actually, do you know how you can help me? You can help me by talking to me about it today, or not talking to me about it today, or by mowing my lawn or babysitting my child, or whatever it is. But I think it is beholden upon us as best we can to help those who want to help us. There are certainly things that I wrote a whole piece on, things that friends and family mustn't say to the bereaved. The comparing your grief stories, that's not helpful. When somebody says to you, "Oh, I know my hamster died," not good.
Yeah, not good.
No, but I think it's. Yeah, so there's a whole chapter of things in there. One of the most important things, I guess, is letting the bereaved tell their story when they want to, and listening, really being an active listener. So not trying to add bits, but just to actually listen to them, because what the bereaved are doing when they tell their story, you know how some people want to tell it over and over again? That's because they are trying to order the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. They're trying to put their smashed life scheme back together. And sometimes you might say, oh, that reminds me of something. You might just interject with some small piece of that they will find relevant, and that will add to their jigsaw puzzle. Does that make sense? I think, that's what sometimes we're asking for with the bereaved. We're telling you all what's gone on, and you might say something, and then I think, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that before. It's a fine line, but definitely letting people tell their story is really important.
Yeah, I would also encourage those who haven't read the book to certainly to get it and read it. It is not only if you're bereaving or going through the grieving process, but it prepares you to also, I think, help others. And like you said, you talked about in the book, it's by the way, there's a great poem, and I'm not going to read it here, but it's in the book. I tried to find it online, but I couldn't. But I didn't search thoroughly. I think the name of the poem is "Just Say You're Sorry," and I was reading. I was like, "Wow, this is so great!" And it just talked about some of the things you said. Just to say to those going through it, "Hey, I'm here. If you need anything, I'm so sorry." But then people try to add to it. She's in a better place. That doesn't help.
No,
God wanted her. It's like, what? No. So there's they mean well, but they go too far, and none of that is necessarily necessary. But also some of it can be hurtful, or it doesn't help at all. It makes it a little worse. So anyway, that poem is kind of expresses it. Just say you're sorry. What is post-traumatic growth?
Yes, it's post-traumatic growth I'd learned about at the University of Pennsylvania, and they were working with the Army at the time to make them as psychologically fit as they are physically fit. And interesting, you ask the Army how many of them know about PTSD, and everyone puts their hand up. You ask them how many people know of post-traumatic growth, and hardly anybody does. So it is a thing, and really what it describes is there are 4 criteria for to say that you've experienced post-traumatic growth. The first is we have to have some kind of precipitating seismic event that disrupts the world as we know it. And then we have to sort of rebuild it in a meaningful and coherent way. And so I said to you earlier on, that's reconstructing your life story. The third is a realization that we have kind of grown in a significant way. I mean, I think actually the specific wording is that we've changed for the better. I don't like that, because I don't feel that I want to be or can be. It's not about betterment, but I think there is a significant change. And the last is that we attribute that change to the precipitating event. So, absolutely, I can see I have had post-traumatic growth in my life. Is it better? No, I don't want to say it's better. But I have, because of the girl's death, I've reevaluated my life. I've written this book, which has seen my work move in an unexpected direction. And I've partly done so to make some sense come out of the senseless. For me, it is very much a part of me trying to get something good come out of what has been so bad. So, I think that does hit the criteria for post-traumatic growth. So.
Yeah, I remember 9/11. In the couple of years after 9/11, so many people reevaluating their lives, changing careers. It was this catalyst to say, "Whoa, life is short. What am I doing?" Or Lucy, this has been very, very good for me. Thank you. But I also think for many of our listeners, this is going to be very, very helpful. There's something cathartic about just talking about it with someone else, and I it's probably not good to always keep something inside and rarely bringing it out and discussing what you're feeling. But so this has been good for me, and I thank you for that. But again, thank you for writing the book, but also coming on here and talking about it. And I know when I'm okay talking about this with people, and especially now at this point in my life. But I never know when that it's that ambush grief. I never know, man. That's right on the corner. So it's a risk. Thank you for taking that risk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry, and to all of your listeners too. Somehow it is a journey that we're on, all of us together. We're all learning, aren't we? And if you can share any experience that helps other people, then that does make it a little bit better for ourselves, I think. So I really appreciate your interest in my work.
Are there any other, I don't know, tools or books or resources that you would recommend along this line?
I did really like Tom Attig's book. I think it's called Relearning the World.
How do you spell his last name?
It's Attig. But I'm a research academic. Actually, the other book, what was that? The Primates of Park Avenue. My husband and I both read soon after Abby died. And it's not about grief, but in it, there is a section where there is child bereavement is discussed. And I quoted that book quite a lot in my book because it gave me the belief that humans have it within us to get through even child bereavement. It says something about the software of mother loss resides within us. And I thought that's a lighter, much lighter read.
No, but it sounds interesting. It's The Primates at Park Avenue.
Primates of Park Avenue. It's a kind of sociological, kind of humorous insight into what it is to live on the Upper East Side in New York. So I heard it on the radio at the time, soon after the girls died. And I think just reading, actually, that's what I would say to your listeners, just reading anything about grief, really helped me. And reading really helped me distract my brain in the middle of the night. My Kindle was my favorite friend.
Where should we point people to find you?
So I have a website that is called resilientgrieving.com, but it's pretty empty with nothing on it. So I'm working on that's a work in progress when I get some time. But otherwise, people can find me on Facebook at One Wild and Precious Life. So you can find me there. That's probably the most frequent place that I visit to post about grief and resilience.
One Wild and Precious Life. But you also have another book, right? What Abby Taught Us? Is that
same book? Yes, that was what it was initially called.
Oh, I thought
okay. Because it was such a big news story at the time, that she'd already made headlines, and people feel in New Zealand very personally about that story. So. But really, it now has also been renamed Resilient Grieving here in New Zealand and in America.
So resilientgrieving.com is to come. That's a work in progress. And the Facebook, One Wild and Precious Life. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Lucy, again, thank you so much for coming on and not only sharing your story, but, instructing us on resilience and what you've learned in its application and how we can do the same.
Thanks very much, Larry.
Well, that is all the time we have today. Please spread the word if you enjoyed the episode. Leave us a review on iTunes and share it with your friends on your favorite social platforms. Big thank you to Sam Williams, my audio guy. Make sure you visit LarryWeeks.com for all my content, and we will talk again soon.